Okay, next up is the variations of the dark stage. So now in this stage we start looking at the darks in a new way. We start looking for very subtle variations in here, like the core shadows or bedbug lines or the reflected lights next to them, for example. On this shadow there's not terribly much happening. Like, I want to say there's a little bit of a lighter value in here, but not very distinctly like reflected light. Then of course in this area we have some reflected light, but that's more or less it. So let's just start working those in. I actually grabbed a HB pencil now. Maybe I should actually work with the HB for the very dark tones. Sorry, the 2B. Just checking which lead I'm actually using, which it is 2B. Here we're just trying to kind of lay this very dark area down here. But we don't want to like create super sharp things in the shadows generally. It's just the way our eyes work, that things in shadow tend to appear a little, less sharp than in the light areas. So as I was saying before, we tend to want to gravitate towards leaving the toning stage a little bit lighter than it needs to be. We want to have enough contrast so we can actually make the form turn and have it pretty close to the value of the bedbug line, but when we're working this stage we can just re-establish those bedbug lines pretty easily. We might have to go in and touch the transition a little bit if we want to maintain that, but the rendering stage is essentially for that. We don't really have to worry too much about it. The rendering stage will take care of exactly this kind of stuff, where we transition from dark to light and make sure the transition is correct, describing the form well. For me, I feel like I'm kind of dark enough already. So like the contrast is appearing right. But the shadows in general, I don't feel like I have to really push it a lot darker than these to sort of maintain a similar visual effect to the reference I'm dealing with. So regardless of what I just said, I'll have to probably lighten this reflected light just a little bit, and I'm actually doing it with this thumb, so you'll see it lifts up a little bit of the value in there. I'll just move my hand out of the way so you can actually see that something is happening here. And here we're starting to kind of describe the right glute a little bit more. Maybe I'll just use the darker end so I don't lift things up too much. Now I need to redefine the contour of this glute. And we can see this kind of diagonal relationship between this bottom of this glute and this one, which is related to the pose, which is, I suppose, the contrapposto, which most people know from their, mandatory art classes in school. When the weight is on one leg, usually that side the glute kind of contracts a little bit, and the other non-weight bearing leg, the knee kind of juts a bit forward and the glute is a bit more relaxed, so it's a bit lower. Okay, maybe we should actually start by now at establishing the very darkest value we want to have within the picture. That is actually how we want to start this stage off. I was in a hurry to show you guys some reflected lights, so yeah, now this is looking pretty much what we want it to be, so a little bit darker than what I had there. Want to have that little bit of contrast. So let's push the value around here as well. So I'm still working with the HB and 2B. The HB is pretty good for working in the shadows in a little bit more precise way. Holds its point quite well, so. And we can make this thing work with very little contrast actually in the shadows. You will see it doesn't take a lot. Oops. The heartbreaking sound of a pencil falling. In this case, the resharpening is a bit quicker. If you're working with traditional pencils, I recommend you sharpen at least like 2 to 3 of each. The 2Bs you will use the most. The 2H, H maybe less so, but I recommend you have a couple that you can then sharpen. And when you run out of, you know, a sharp point or you drop it, you just pick up another one and you don't have to like stop everything. So yeah, it can be a bit intimidating and start to kind of find this stuff without previously drawing it out, but you know, you can do it. I feel like it's working very subtle ways in the shadows, so you can just inch yourself towards the result. And even though I'm working in pretty minute things here, I'm just mostly toning things to the right value. Not yet really rendering the darks, but we want to arrive at something that's pretty close to finished. Rendering the darks will be mostly just, you know, cleaning up the tones. Want them to be pretty close to finished, so because want the values and the sort of reflected lights to work already, because then we're gonna render the lights. After that, we don't really want to touch the bedbug line anymore, so it's more like we just nudge things in the darks then. So we want to keep things soft. Just slightly touch it over there so it doesn't appear as sharp. Maybe we just darken things a little bit over here. We don't really want it sharper, but perhaps a little darker. When working in the darks, usually when in doubt, you can just try to make things darker rather than lighten them, so that way you'll at least maintain the contrast and the sort of pop of the image. You don't sort of wash it out, if that's a term. I don't know. Because yeah, these things can feel a little bit lacking sometimes if they're not, you know, dark enough. But yeah, I think that's pretty close to what I want to achieve on this gluteal section. Now I'm just looking at this bedbug line here and just trying to make sure it is dark enough. Actually, I'll pick this up. We don't really need it, but I want to work from below the image so you actually see a bit more of what I'm doing. It's probably not very fun to look at the drawing when I'm casting a shadow over what I'm doing. And I'm not being very, you know, I don't think I'm being careful enough, you know, just pulling those lines across there. Ideally, we won't be destroying what we put down earlier, rather reinforcing it, but you know, we're humans also, so. Okay, that's good enough for me over there. Let's just start working on the back area then. See a pretty dark sort of crease running in here. Defined by the back muscles, obviously, so. This section right here is actually just pretty dark all over. This sort of little bit of the lower back over there, or whichever part we name it, but this is a pretty dark section actually because it's pretty vertical. There's not much reflected light bouncing up on it, so it tends to be that things that are very, you know, vertical, they don't really catch a lot. More the things that are facing downwards will catch the rays of light bouncing up on them. And usually, of course, if it's facing slightly upwards, it might catch some ambient light, you know, bouncing maybe from the ceiling or from the sky, something like that. Again, let's just make sure this thing is dark enough. So, okay, and it's okay to go section by section. We don't have to like rush around the picture. This outline is actually pretty darn dark. And honestly, here we can actually reinforce the articulation of the outline a little bit more if you wish to. So if I want to make something, you know, very much darker, I'm using the 2B mostly. I'm switching the pencils quite a bit here, so if I want it darker, I'll use the 2B because it's softer and it just leaves a darker tone more easily. I don't have to scrub as long. And when I'm trying to maybe smooth things out or slightly shift the average value or make a transition or something like this, then I'll use the the HB. And that would be simply for the reason because it's just more subtle. Another thing to point out here is, you know, I was talking about the fact that, you know, these vertical sort of planes tend to be darker, but also the higher you go up away from the ground, and as such the light source of the reflected lights, the darker these things will become. So I mean, it's kind of subtle on this cast, but you know, these reflections here they are definitely lighter than this reflected light over here. If you squint, you almost can't see it. These are, I feel, way more, you know, easily visible. So when I'm fixing something like this, you know, which is a pretty abstract shape, I want to obviously like try to match the size of it, but I'm squinting a lot so I can sort of see the shape a bit better. But also I'm checking for horizontal alignments, you know, where does this bottom of the scapula kind of relate to this, which is accurately measured. So I can just, you know, even put my pencil here. I'm doing this visually, of course, all the time, but I can sort of gauge if the height and the the height and how tall it is actually all right. Talking about height, I mean how high it is placed on this paper. I feel the width, you know, this way is pretty all right. It's not perfect, but obviously it's close enough. So now I'm a bit more happy with that shape. So after fixing the shape, we can then, you know, readdress the transitions a little bit, and we don't really have to, but also I feel like it needs to be slightly darker. So let's just darken it slightly in the center in a soft sort of manner. All right. On this plate here, you can see almost a little bit of hatching, you know, going kind of like horizontally. So we just have to kind of take an average tone and create that instead of the hatch marks. I feel like you can just copy the hatching as well, but you don't have to. The way we usually try to interpret that is just tonally. Also I see there's a little bit of shadow underneath here as well, so I'll just kind of put that in there. It's a bit too large on this side, so you might run into things like this that you overlooked initially. You don't have to worry about it, you can just put it in now. We are not too worried about it. Just get it in there now. That now is, you know, now is a good enough time. Yeah, usually you want to work stage by stage so you don't sort of jump around, but of course, you know, just fix the things when you spot them. Yeah, speaking of jumping around, fixing things, you know, maybe it's not the best thing to sort of get too stuck on things, but yeah, if there's something major, you generally want to fix it sooner rather than later, and if there's something minor, you know, you could just write it down and get back to it later. This is mainly just so you don't sort of lose focus when you're doing the stages. I can just reinforce the outlines a little bit since we lost a little bit of the sharpness of these when we did the big form modeling. But yeah, we don't really have to worry about the outline too much. Also, rendering stage includes the final refinement of the outline, so we can leave that for later. Here we pretty much lost the bedbug line entirely when we did the big form modeling. Just trying to make the reflected light here slightly more evident. We want to keep it pretty subtle, but I'm just kind of looking around before I wrap up this stage. Am I happy with the bedbug lines, because that's what we will be needing for the rendering of the lights. So we can always of course work that as well, but you know, if it's the right value in the right place, that of course leaves us with a little bit less work to do. Just try to soften some things a little bit, bring back that turning tone. We're coming to a place in the drawing where, you know, it's probably a bit hard to even tell on the camera if something is happening, so it's probably not very informative. So yeah, I think we'll just head on to the next stage. Before that, I'll take a break. Okay, final stage before we start finishing the lights. So the stage is called the Planes of Light stage. That's what we called it in school. I think it's descriptive. So this is where we basically want to describe any kind of anatomy and all these kind of smaller nuances of the form. Basically, these things we left over here are just, you know, they're just planes of halftones, or that's how we wanted them to be represented here. So actually, before we go into those, the correct order would be, you know, well, the order I was taught would be to first do the planes in light, in the lightest places. We like to still use the tools for these, not just the pencils. If you want, you can use the pencils, but the point here is to kind of be efficient. So the goal is to lay in the correct tone in the correct shape if we want to be very concise about what the goal of the stage is. There's this kind of, I guess this could be a bit of the obliques on our very ripped Greek statue, kind of creating a little halftone over here. And we want to keep it basically as light as we can in the lights, because that is how we kind of maintain the strength of the light source. If we put very dark things in the middle of the light, even if they appear super dark, we want to kind of play those down, so the overarching big form, as we call it in the stage, stays dominant, and these smaller forms kind of play along with it. And that's one of the sort of tricks to maintaining the illusion of form. So to me this plane is pretty good. It starts sort of blending away slightly when you squint. This portion is a little bit darker. This portion up here kind of blends with the halftone next to it. So that said, we can maybe make that a little bit darker in here. Okay, which planes do we have that are in the very center of the light? There's this kind of plane that is describing the, I think it's either the lat starting off there, or it could be the serratus, depending on the kind of the position of the arm. It sort of changes which one is a little bit more dominant over there. But honestly, it's just super vague over there. In this reference, there's some blotches of tone there, so we just kind of indicate there's a little bit of form happening there. This one we already tackled a little bit. Maybe behind it there's a little bit less form, and we can now perhaps add a little bit of tone that it kind of matches the visual situation we see on the reference. Just sort of pull the modeling a little bit further. So first we do the planes that are in the lightest places, then we do the dark planes that are next to the dark areas. So maybe we can, reinforce this plane here a little bit. As you can see, I'm using the stubby brush for the darker things because this is super saturated with graphite. Actually, it leaves a pretty dark mark when you work it into the paper. And now I'm spotting a little bit of a drawing error here. It kind of feels like this is bulging a little bit too much out. I noticed the kind of relationship between this line here that is kind of created by the shadow continues into the right side of the back. Once again, it's probably not just the one thing, it's probably a bit of both, so let's just bring this also a little bit, very slightly, but a little bit along towards here to help things along. Now we can get that relationship correct again. Otherwise it's anatomically a little bit weird, because the right back muscle of course connects to the right side. Also over here, so it would not make sense that we have just a weird line kind of carrying out into whatever structure. So we can actually use a bit of anatomical knowledge here already to help us along. Speaking of anatomy, I don't think maybe I stated it before, but I'm not going to be teaching anatomy. There's super good resources for it out there. Also, I knew it from my profession before I actually started studying art, so I have never really studied anatomy from the perspective of an artist that much. A little bit, yes, but not super intentionally, so I don't really have a structured way to teach you anatomy. So also, a huge creator like Proko took like multiple years to create his anatomy course, so and I of course know that it's for a reason. It's a very, very large, sort of complex topic to tackle, especially for a single man like myself. I'm not single, I'm married, but a single guy making these videos. So yeah, go learn anatomy elsewhere. I will provide you some good tips for where you can learn those, some books and some videos perhaps. And here I'm again straying a little bit outside of this stage, so I'll stop that. Let's do that later. Here we have a kind of top facing plane, sort of defines this triangular region here. Then we can place this kind of side plane for that. Guess that's the iliac crest there, kind of making this darker tone over here. Oh yes, this little thing. Let's just put it in. There's this very subtle kind of, as I said, I think it's intentional, but it's super subtle on the printout, at least for me. Just kind of describing the, perhaps the tensor fascia lata, or however that's supposed to be pronounced. The names, I know how to pronounce them in Latin and in Finnish, but English never really got used to it. Okay, so I'm kind of working all over the place here. Let's go back to the darker planes here. Now that I'm placing this darker stuff here, we start to notice this looks very light next to it, so we actually didn't darken this enough during the big 4 modeling stage. So maybe we'll just kind of go and mush things a little bit darker over there overall. Okay, and now that results in our shadow over here seeming a little bit too light again, so let's just go ahead and fix that issue. And yeah, maybe this brush only isn't actually gonna get us close enough to this, so I'll just kind of mass in the tone roughly in the shape of the plane I'm seeing, and then tackle it with the brush. See where that leaves us. Also here we want to actually pull the modeling a little bit further into the lights here, because we darkened this, then that transition was a bit too abrupt. So we just sort of rethink our form here. Okay. Now that's already looking a little bit more three-dimensional. Let's darken this shadow a bit as well. Also, anytime you start feeling like you're in too fine details for the tools you're using, then just, feel free to do whatever you feel most comfortable doing. These tools can make the process a bit faster, so that's why we're learning to use them. But, I understand there's preferences here. I think this point of the shadow also moved a little bit downwards when we were big 4 modeling, so let's just fix that. Okay, and I think these aren't really dark enough yet, so let's just push those a little bit. Just roughly sort of draw these while massing them in. Sort of laid the groundwork with the brush, but we don't have to, go all the way just using that single thing. So I'll just add a bit of halftones here as well, just to make it slightly nicer, very roughly, just not getting too picky yet. So let's darken these as well, just slightly. We want to be a little bit darker than the big 4 modeling. As we established previously, we're working with the total contrast, and we're not really trying to match the value we see on the reference here. So that's why I recommend maybe you get a toned paper for this, and you can then just match 1 for 1. If something seems darker here, you can just darken it over here. You don't have to get too analytical about it at this early stage yet. Okay, maybe that's enough for those actually. Just a little fix on the drawing there. just nudging the shapes, but we don't want to get too, you know, caught up, especially using a pencil at this stage. I'll just smooth things over a little bit over here. The last stage for the planes of light stage is the exceptions, where there's light planes in dark places and dark planes in light places. So in a way, you know, this is an exception. It's not, you know, a plane in light, it's a shadow, but it's, you know, in the very middle of a very light place. So I feel maybe it's a choice that this shadow was actually left a little bit lighter because of that in the reference, rather than, you know, making it super dark like this. It will look a bit weird when there's just a small black space in the middle of the stark white cast or statue or whatever. Oh yes, and then there's actually, I'm spotting this plane here. It's a sort of the rib cage meeting the back muscles, I suppose, creates this kind of form. It's also pretty subtle, so let's not make it super obvious. When I say subtle, I mean it like barely see the tone and it still already starts working. And yeah, I mean, you can take this pretty far as well. You can just start looking for very minute planes, basically shapes of tone, and just work on them. Try to get them very precise. But you can also just kind of start moving towards the rendering stage. So yeah, I think from this point we will move to the rendering stage, which is the finishing stage. We'll have to see how much I will render this. Rendering takes usually, you know, the rough estimate is at least 2 times as long as whatever you took to get to this point. So that's actually where you take the longest if you want to really refine and push things, because you go over every single, you know, area. And the way we do it in this approach is we just pick an area, you know, perhaps we pick this area here, and that would be, you know, almost an entire session of 3 hours in school, and we just make sure every transition, every bit is exactly the same as here. We fix shapes, we fix values, we fix softness and sharpness of the edges, and yeah, that's how we achieve the very nice result. So obviously I'm not gonna use that much time on this one, so I'll probably be a little bit rougher, you know, just try to go pretty quickly over each area and just compare and have something looking like that. And yeah, let's look at that stage next. Okay, plan was to move on to the rendering stage next, but I noticed there's a little bit of work we can still do over here. We can just darken some things here and add a little bit of information. You know, we could always do this in pencil, which will be what we're using in the next stage when finishing, but you know, I think it's smarter to use the tools where you can, because they will speed things up a bit. So this is a long and tedious process already, so it's smart to, you know, make use of whatever kind of normal art making tools we have at our disposal. We don't really have to, you know, make things more slow and tedious than they already are. I mean, some schools only use pencils, and that's fine, but I think it's good to, you know, at least know about this approach as well. You could do this entire picture just as well with a pencil. It'll probably just take a little bit longer, so whichever you want to go for is fine, but at least you know the options now. So now that I darkened this area a little bit, we need to darken the tone next to it a little bit so it actually appears round again, at least somewhat. We're gonna tackle the transition more in the rendering stage. So now that we have the information in place, we can probably start. Let's just make this spot here a little bit darker, because that's what I see happening there. Kind of turns away from the sort of the peak of the trapezius there. So okay,